Hi, welcome to a Physionic study analysis, detailed study analysis. We're going to be going over 7 studies, of which one of those studies also includes a meta-analysis of 17 studies, so quite a few studies being incorporated in this analysis, where we're going to try to find out if omega-3 supplementation can help reverse or prevent mild cognitive impairment. So we're talking about things like memory, executive function, global cognition, things that are related to your thinking ability, especially as we age, considering that's the population that we'll be focused on. But there's going to be a little bit of data on younger individuals as well. So we're going to be covering a lot of information. I'm going to go into the proposed mechanisms of how omega-3s are supposed to be helping our brain cells. And then we're going to actually go into the analysis and look at all the data. If you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in molecular medicine, and I get absolutely blown away with the level of excitement that I get from reading studies. So I analyze them, and that's what you get to enjoy or torture yourself with in this video. So if you're interested in learning about how omega-3s affect our cognition, then you're in the right place, because this is going to be extremely in-depth. And of course, I'm going to predict, obviously I haven't recorded this as I'm recording it right now, I'm going to predict this is probably going to be well over 1 hour long. So buckle up and let's get into it. All right, so as I mentioned, a few of the things that we're going to be covering. The first thing is that we're going to understand the mechanisms for omega-3s in the brain. So I'm just going to label a few of them. There's, I'm sure, plenty more than what I'm covering here, but for the time being, that's what we're going to focus on, just a few of them. Then I'm going to go into how omega-3 supplementation has an effect on cognition as a whole, but I'm going to separate that based off of memory, learning, reaction time, and a few other metrics. So that's what's going to be publicly available if you're watching the public version of this video. Now, for my insiders, if you're part of my insiders program, you'll also get pooled data. So I pulled together all the data from all these studies, from the 17 studies from the meta-analysis plus the 6 others that I use for my independent analysis to determine the optimal dosing that one should implement, assuming that there is a significant effect. Then we're going to go into which omega-3s to actually focus on. Should it be DHA? Should it be EPA? Whatever it might be, I'm going to tell you a definitive answer for which one to focus on when it comes to cognition. Then I'm also going to go, there's a little bit of data from a few different studies looking at other health effects, looking at blood pressure, cholesterol, triglycerides, weight, things like that, and the effect that omega-3 supplementation can have. So I'll be covering that as well. And then some really intriguing preliminary data on sex-specific differences in omega-3 effects. So how they differ between women and men. So if you're interested in accessing all of this content, then certainly subscribe to my Insiders program, where you'll get access to this, plus many, many other study analyses and seminars and live sessions with me and a bunch of other good stuff. But if you're just interested in these two, then stick around in the public, the free public available content. Okay, so we're going to go over these studies that I've listed. Of course, as usual, I put numbers so that they're easy to categorize and to find. If you were to watch this after the fact at some point, maybe 2 years down the line, I'll hopefully be in the many hundreds more studies above this. So you can go back and find them. So these are the studies. I'll remind you of them. I'll also discuss the funding sources as we get to each study individually. I think that's just a better way of going about things than my previous method. All right, so let's get into understanding the mechanism behind omega-3s and the brain. Now this, just because I'm covering the mechanism, does not mean that I'm already giving you proof that omega-3s have an effect on cognition. This is just the proposed mechanisms that from more in vitro style studies. So studies that are done in cells, studies that are done in animals, more invasive models, things like that. So one thing that we know is that omega-3s are heavily involved in our brain, specifically docosahexaenoic acids, which is DHA, but we also have EPA in our brain, and we also have a little bit of some of the others, but the main two are those two, so that's what I'm going to be focused on. So DHA and EPA are found in our brain cells. So if we were to look at our brain and then zoom into our brain and then look at one single cell in our brain, we would identify something like this, which is a neuron. Now, a neuron is not the only type of brain cell that there is. There's also astrocytes and microglia and cells of that nature. But those are more support cells, immune cells. When we typically think of the brain, we think about neurons. Now, surely a neurophysiologist or a neuroscientist might disagree with me, but I think that's a pretty safe bet. And part of those neurons, what makes up those neurons, is these fats, these polyunsaturated fats, these omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. So how do they affect our neurons? Well, one of the proposed mechanisms is through the incorporation of what are known as lipid rafts. So let me back up. We've got our brain. We've zoomed into our brain. We've zoomed into a single neuron, a single brain cell. Then we zoom into that brain cell and we look at the cell membrane. So here we've got the outside of our cell. So this would be the extracellular fluid. And this would be like cerebrospinal fluid, for example. Then you've got the cell membrane, which separates the outside of the cell from the inside of the cell. And part of this cell membrane is what's known as a phospholipid membrane. So it's made up of different components of, it can be proteins, can certainly be fats, and a little bit of carbohydrates as well. So the makeup of that cell membrane has significant impact on the health of our brain cells, and I'll be describing a few different ways how. But one of those is through these lipid rafts, which are found embedded inside of our cell membranes. And this is not exclusive to neurons. It's not exclusive to brain cells. This actually happens also with any number of cells, kidney cells, if we're talking about liver cells, whatever it might be, muscle cells. And these lipid rafts serve a number of different functions, but one of the main functions that they serve is to act as scaffolds. What do I mean by that? I mean that these lipid rafts are these concentrations of protein, of specific proteins, specific cholesterol molecules, specific carbohydrates, fats that are all localized together, and they hold on to key signaling molecules. So for your cell to be able to, in a sense, not exactly, but in a sense, think and react to different things, it needs to have signaling molecules. So these molecules will interact with one another. You've probably heard of terms like enzymes before. Enzymes will interact with one another and then cause downstream reactions. I'm not going to go into too much more detail than that because we can go down a whole nother area in cell biology and molecular biology known as cell signaling. But for the cell to be able to propagate a signal from one area of the cell, let's say the surface of the cell membrane, to the inside of the cell, to the very depths of the cell, to express different genes, to create proteins, to move different segments of the cell to another area of the cell, there have to be signaling proteins, signaling molecules. And some of those key signaling molecules are found embedded in the lipid raft or near the lipid raft. So these concentrations, this area concentrates a lot of the key signaling proteins, key signaling molecules. Now, if you have fewer of these lipid rafts, sometimes that's a benefit. At other times, it's better to have more lipid rafts. It really depends on circumstance, which gets way too granular to get into in this video. But if you want the appropriate amount or the potential for the appropriate amount of these lipid rafts, they also have to be composed. That you have to have enough of the correct resources to produce these lipid rafts. And so here we've got an image of some proteins, we've got some cholesterol, we have some oligosaccharides, which are sugar molecules that are embedded on the outside. And one of the key components is these omega-3s. And when these omega-3s get taken up, they get consumed, they get taken into the cell, then they can be used in certain instances to be embedded into these lipid rafts. And we're going to discuss one of the added benefits of that. So it attracts these signaling molecules to these lipid rafts, which then leads to greater ability for the cell to propagate that signal. So these surface proteins are then able to interact with one another, which sends a signal further down that can attract other signals that then leave the lipid raft and will go and interact with other proteins further deeper down inside the cell. Now, on top of that, omega-3s, so if I can go back here real quick, omega-3s actually also can be used to produce phosphatidylserine molecules. I believe that's the correct one, among many other molecules. But one of them that was mentioned in one of the reviews that I read, which is actually not included in the study analysis here, but I'm using some of the references, which I'll add a link to it as well, is that these phosphatidylserines, if you have depleted levels of phosphatidylserine, and again, I think that's the correct molecule, I could be getting it confused, but I think that's right, can have drastic negative effects on your brain cells, meaning that they can die more easily if they're perturbed in some way. They're less robust in their ability to fight off infections, things of that nature. So these omega-3s have a high propensity to be able to be converted into these phosphatidylserines, which bolsters the levels that are found. And in aged, I believe, animals, they found that phosphatidylserine levels tend to be lower. So boosting those omega-3s so that they can be converted into this other molecule is a benefit through this kind of ancillary mechanism. So not only do they have direct effects, they can also have effects through other mechanisms or other molecules by conversion. Another thing is that omega-3s help the cell membrane, so we're still looking at a cell membrane here, can help the cell membrane be more fluid. Why would you want that? Well, the reason you would want that is because it allows for, if you have any sort of indentation, let's say you a great example of this would be if you play football, or if you have any sort of micro concussion that occurs to the brain. It doesn't, you don't have to be a 70-year-old that's playing football. You can get a concussion from any number of different things. But let's say you get a micro concussion, so something that you don't necessarily, like you don't black out or anything, but you do trauma to the brain. That microfluidity allows the cell membrane to deform and come back to its correct position, the way that it's supposed to be. If you have a rigid membrane, you can get that deformation, and then it can break the membrane, which then ultimately leads to cell death, or it can lead to cell death. So these omega-3s actually allow the membrane to be more fluid as necessary. So that's an additional benefit. Another benefit is that these neurons, these cells, have to be able to extend out and speak, so to speak to other neurons. So the brain doesn't function unless you have billions of neurons that are constantly in communication with one another. And the only way they can do that is if they're close to one another. So this is a bit of a display of that. So we've got a neuron here, we've got a neuron here, and if you're maybe a little bit familiar with neurophysiology and neuroscience, you know that here we've got our dendrites, we've got our soma, so we've got the cell body, which is at the very top of the cell, if you want to put it kind of anatomically. Then it propagates a signal down this axon. These are myelin sheaths, that fatty deposits that are present to speed up the reaction. Will send a signal down the axon and then go to the axon terminals. At these axon terminals, you've reached the end of a single cell. Now that cell needs to propagate that signal to another cell. So that's why they have to be close to one another, and they get really close to one another, because if we zoom into the end of the axon terminal right here, we've got our first cell right here. We've got our second cell right here. So we've got a axon terminal and we've got a dendrite. And this cell will then release signals, neurotransmitters, neurochemicals, which will then bind to the dendrite and then propagate that signal. And then the same thing happens across this signal. And it happens over millions and millions and millions of times. So these cells have to be able to be close to one another, and they have to be able to form more of these axon terminals and different synapses so that they can communicate with more cells. And omega-3s have been linked to creating greater what's known as synaptogenesis. So the ability to produce more of these axons and be able to produce more of these connections between different cells, and for it to be able to migrate and move to different areas so that they can actually communicate with other cells. So this is critical for you may have heard this, neuroplasticity, the ability for your cells to not necessarily grow more cells, but with the cells that you already have, for them to adapt to their environment, for them to be able to be, in a sense, fluid, where they're able to then move with one another. Okay, so, and then the final one that I wanted to discuss was that omega-3s seem to also have an effect in terms of regulating neural stem cell growth. So as children, we have significant amounts of these neural stem cells, and they undergo a process known as differentiation, differentiating into different neural populations, so different neural cells, neurons that we discussed earlier. So we want to go from a neural stem cell, a baby cell, essentially, to a adult neuron. And omega-3s, through mechanisms that I'm not going to go into in great detail here, can interact with these neural stem cells and convince them to turn into neurons and can populate the neuron population. Now, what was thought maybe 10 years ago, something like that, was that adults don't have this capacity anymore, that we don't have these neural stem cells that can then be converted into adult cells. That is not the case. So we found out that we can actually generate more neurons. It is certainly at a much slower pace than when we were children, but we still have that ability. And omega-3s allow those neural stem cells to differentiate into more neurons. Not only that, stem cells have another capacity that they can self-replicate. They can produce more of themselves. Now, I haven't done any investigation beyond what I've just told you, so I don't know if it actually stimulates greater levels of proliferation, which is the production of more cells, of these stem cells. I've only focused on the differentiation part, but it does seem to lead to greater differentiation to more neurons, which if you have a neural stem cell population, then you're taking advantage of it. So those are a few of the different mechanisms by which omega-3s are proposed to have an effect. Now, just because they do these things, does that actually translate to real world effects? That's the question, right? So that's what we're going to get into. All right, so we're going to be starting off with study 124, and this was publicly funded. So there was no association to any sort of industry in any way whatsoever. I believe most of this was done in Germany. So this was through their publicly funding agency, so government money, so public taxpayer money. Now, to walk us through this as usual, again, if you've been following Physionic for a while, you know that we have to do this because we want to be pretty rigorous with this. So I'm going to be giving you some basic illustrations of each study, so how they went about each study. So we have, in this study, they recruited 44 men and women that were between 61 and 63 years of age. They were generally healthy, so they didn't have like metabolic syndrome. They weren't severely overweight or anything like that. And they separated these individuals into an omega-3 group and a placebo group. The placebo group is a group that did not receive omega-3. And if you're interested in what the placebo group consumed, they consumed 4,000 milligrams of sunflower oil. So sometimes that's important because you don't want the placebo to be too different from the main treatment, so the actual omega-3s. So in this case, they're talking about sunflower oil. And this was a randomized trial. That's great to see. So these are to cover our bases. So the kind of the basics that a study should have is that it's randomized. So the researchers didn't have a say on who belongs in which group. And so it was just randomly allocated. They had like a computer generated, you go here, you go here, you go here, completely unbiased. It was double blind. So the researchers didn't know which group each individual was in. And the participants also did not know which group that they were in. So that, again, removes significant amounts of bias. So this is excellent. And the duration was quite long, which is probably pretty important if you're talking about a condition where you're looking at cognition, because cognition is not something that turns over instantly. It's not like you take a supplement and then later that day or the next day or a week later, you're like, okay, now I feel amazing. It doesn't quite work that way. So with cognition, there's very slow turnover. Again, that might not be as much the case when you're a child, but even as a child, it's certainly much slower in the brain than it is for something like your enterocytes of your intestines, which turn over basically every day, just constantly replicating themselves. So 6.5 months, something along those lines. So not bad. Everything looks pretty good here. Another thing to look at, however, is to look at if the treatment actually led to a change in omega-3. So if you were to take some measurements of the omega-3 level in the blood, do you actually see increases in omega-3? It's kind of pointless to have a treatment where, hey, you should be supplementing with omega-3, and then the omega-3 levels don't increase in the blood, because then that means you're probably not going to have any physiological outcome. So they wanted to test this. So this is good that they check the baseline here. So we've got our placebo here, the pre, and we've got our LCN3 fatty acid. So long chain at the 3 site of the long chain. So a double bond at the 3 site of fatty acid. This is omega-3. You're going to see this several times across multiple studies. So just be sure that every time you see this, you think, okay, that's omega-3. It's not like they're necessarily going to say omega-3. Some of them might, but most of them are going to write it something like this. And what we see at pre-study versus post-study. So pre-study, the values of omega-3s were about the same between the omega-3 consuming group and the placebo consuming group. And then after the study, so after the 6 months, there was a significant rise in the omega group. Now there's maybe a slight decline as well in the placebo group, which could lead to this a bit more feed into a bit more of this delta. So the difference between the two. So that's something to keep an attention on. But I mean, most likely, I think we'd all agree that if you have omega-3s at below 8 and then it jumps up to 10, you're seeing a pretty significant increase with omega-3 supplementation. So this is great. It indicates, okay, yes, we're definitely seeing an effect of supplementation. Okay, now we're looking at we're looking at 2 different measures, and I realize this is a lot, but I'm going to focus your attention on just a few different metrics, and those will probably be the most important. So one is to look over here. So ignore all of this for the time being, and we're just going to look at this and look at this. And same here, look at this and look at this. So we've got one measure, cued recall, and we've got learning, so the accuracy of learning ability. So when we look at our pre-values, so this is the higher the better. That's essentially what you should be thinking. So we've got our average 65.6 plus 2.9. So that's our standard deviation that they've got listed here. So the variance in the results, which is quite low, 65.6 is your mean plus or minus 2.9. That's really low. So that's fantastic. So they've got the pre-value, and then they've got the post value. And if you were to, again, just look at this, you'd say 65.6 to 78.8. That's a pretty big increase. So there's an improvement in cued recall with the consumption of omega-3s. Okay, fantastic. But we have to make sure that this isn't a placebo effect. So the placebo effect being that if you consume anything, doesn't matter, doesn't even have to be omega-3s. Actually, it's not omega-3s. You don't consume omega-3s, you're just consuming something and you see an effect. And people are sometimes shocked, but you can actually see a physiological effect of just consuming something. Your psychology can be so powerful that it actually has an effect on your body. Now, of course, this is not necessarily an inert placebo, considering they're taking sunflower oil. And what we find is that the pre is 69.5 and then post is 73. So maybe a slight uptick, but it's certainly not as dramatic as what we see with the omega-3s. But again, as you know, if you've been with Physionic for a while, we cannot look at this and say, oh yeah, it looks like it, so I'm just going to assume that that's the case. What we actually have to do is look at the statistics. And now I'd like to reintroduce some of this information. So I'm not going to go over degrees of freedom, F-tests, p-values, or anything like that. But what I do want to point out is the statistics that compare these. So here I've got a list of what this is. So group is the effect of omega-3. So we're comparing omega-3 versus placebo. Okay, that's our main outcome. That's the thing that we're most interested in. Then we've got time. So is there an effect over time? Is it with placebo or with omega-3? Do you just see an effect over time? And that's why they've multiplied these, because we're interested in not just is there an effect of omega-3 or an effect of placebo, but we're also interested is over time, is there an overall effect? So there's kind of you can think of it like a quote unquote combination of the two, which is the most accurate way to go about things. So now we're comparing this change versus this change over time. And what we find is that yes, there's a statistically significant difference between the omega-3 versus the placebo. And this indicates then that there is an improvement in cued recall with omega-3 fatty acid consumption. Now, something else to consider is what's called as the N squared. So the N squared is the effect size when they remove certain levels of what's known as variance introduced by a particular variable. So I believe at this point that they haven't removed anything. So the effect size, if you know anything about Hedges G, or if you know anything about Cohen's D, effect size calculations, you can tell that the effect size is really small. So is there a huge increase, a huge betterment with omega-3s? The answer is no. It's very small. However, when they do a statistical adjustment, so they would do something like what's known as an ANCOVA test. So they eliminate one of the covariates. In this case, they're controlling for dietary habits through statistics. So through differences in dietary habit through statistics. And they find that the effect now strengthens, as in the certainty in the effect strengthens. So that now for sure we think that yes, omega-3s definitely have an effect over time. And the effect size increases. So it may be a factor of your diet as well that could have an influence. But overall, the overall effect is that yes, omega-3s do improve. And beyond that, they also looked at dietary habits plus ApoE levels, because they did measure that, because there's some relationship between ApoE and cognitive decline. And they show that there is still the same effect, but it's not like you don't see a greater effect with the inclusion, or I suppose the exclusion, of ApoE. So in this case, the greatest confounding or covariate factor is diet. And that leads to, even so, it still leads to a small effect size. So is omega-3 going to blow everything out of the water? Are you suddenly going to reverse your dementia-headed mind? No, but you're going to see a small improvement. And then they do a few other analyses based off of just group and then looking at time. And we can do the exact same thing when we're looking at learning accuracy. So block, they've added another variable here, so the number of correct answers that these individuals get. And I'm not going to go into all the different testing mechanisms that they do. So, I mean, they were essentially, just as a brief, they were just asked, they went through a learning phase, and then they were asked, well, how many of these buildings do you recall? And they had to recall them. They were given these images for 3,000 milliseconds, I think. So just a quick blip, and then it was removed, and then they had to check a button or click a button to indicate, yes, I remember, or yes, this was included and this one's not included, whatever it might be. So to distinguish between different buildings that they saw previously in the learning phase. And what they found is that here there is no betterment. So yes, 75 to 78, slightly better. But here it seems like there's an even greater benefit with the placebo, but that's not the claim here. So we have to actually look at the statistics, and really all we can say is that there's no statistical differences. So in learning accuracy, it doesn't seem to have an improvement effect, but in cued recall, this test, it does. So it's kind of a mixed bag when it comes to that. And then they do a bunch of sub-analyses as well. But generally, we can say that there's no effect on learning accuracy, but there is on cued recall. The next study to investigate is study 125. Now, the reason why I have industry associated here is because I believe the researchers received some of the supplements or had some sort of ties, as in they had been paid by a certain research or by a particular industry in previous research that they've done. So not necessarily that this study was funded by industry, but that some of the researchers had received funding for other studies from industry. So I wanted to say associated, and I'll be a little bit stronger with my word on industry link or industry funded if it's actually funded by the industry. But I wanted to throw that out there. Okay, so in this one, they have 84 women and men, about 60 years of age, healthy with subjective cognitive deficits. So these are people that are having a little difficulty remembering, maybe where their keys are. They remembering names. They get names jumbled up. It's not severe. It's not like they can't remember who a person is. They're just kind of mixing things up every once in a while. So, and one drawback of this is that it's subjective. So they're not necessarily doing a test to determine, they're not using an established test or a series of tests to determine what the level of cognitive decline here is. They're just measuring, they're just saying, hey, are you experiencing these things? And then a person just kind of thinks back to themselves and they, yeah, that's actually something that I've experienced. So this is, again, randomized. So as I explained in the last study, this is double blind and it's 6 months long. Again, fantastic. Zero qualms with this. They've got a omega-3 condition. And then they did something a little bit unique in that they had people consume omega-3 plus a multi-nutrient. Okay, so the omega-3 supplement is just by itself. So that's probably what we're going to focus on because I'm not as interested in the information on the multi-nutrient. But if you're interested, I'll go ahead and tell you the multi-nutrient consists of the phosphatidylserine, which is actually something that is the molecule that I mentioned in the mechanism section, as well as Gingko biloba. I don't know how to pronounce that, please forgive me, folic acid and vitamin B12. So fish oil plus all of those other ingredients are included for this group. And then they had a placebo, which was oleic acid in the form of sunflower oil, plus a little bit of omega-3, but very, very little. Like I'm talking about 1/20th or 1/30th. So I'm not entirely certain why they decided to add that in there. But it's probably not going to have an effect, but it's something that we can certainly investigate as well, because if we do start seeing an effect in placebo, then we can check for that placebo effect. But in this case, it's maybe not as much of a placebo effect. It may actually be a real effect. Okay, so to begin here, what we need to do is to look at the baseline values. So for some of these studies, they mentioned some of the baseline values, and I'm going to be reporting on those as well. And we're looking at, so EM is the multi-nutrient formulation plus the omega-3, so keep that in mind. FO is the fish oil, so omega-3, and then the placebo. And then you can see that N is the number of people that are found in each group. Now, some of these people might end up dropping out later on in the study, but typically the numbers stay relatively stable. So we've got these omega-6 fatty acids here. We've got the total number of omega-6 fatty acids. So this is arachidonic acid. And here we've got our total N6, so omega-6. We've got our EPA and DHA, which I mentioned. And then we've got total polyunsaturated fats from omega-3, and then the ratio between them. I'm not going to talk about each one of these. I'm just going to talk about the highlights. What we want to know, again here, is at baseline, they can be at a certain level and preferably to be close to the placebo level, but do we see an increase in the omega-3, the blood omega-3 levels when you supplement with omega-3? As opposed to the placebo, you should not see much of a change, maybe a slight, because they add a teeny tiny bit to the capsule. Okay, so let's look at EPA and DHA, or total N3 PUFAs. And what we see is, again, with this multi-nutrient at the baseline, so this is the mean, so this whole column is for the average. Standard deviation is the amount of variance, and that's across the board. So when we look at the total amount of omega-3, we see it's 5.91 and 5.58 at baseline for the fish oil or the omega-3 consuming groups at baseline. Then 6 months later, they're at 8.81 and 8.56. So yes, there is an increase. And is there an increase in the placebo? No. So this, even though they added a little bit of omega-3 in the placebo, it did not have an effect. It did not have a blood effect. It didn't significantly increase blood values of these omega-3s. So this is good. That's what I'm focused on. If you're interested in any of these other values, now you know how to read it. Just look at baseline, look at the 6 month mark, and then look at these p-values. They're all different. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't actually tease out which. You would need to run what's called a post hoc test to determine which one is actually different. Well, I suppose they do indicate it by these numbers. So whichever numbers are different from one another, those are different from those conditions are different from one another. So they did run a post hoc test. But ultimately, there are differences across the board, which is what you would expect. If you're supplementing with something and then the other group isn't supplementing with something, you would expect some sort of blood values to change. All right, so the other thing to look at is to look at baseline. So this is not after they've been supplemented. This is at baseline, before the 6 months of supplementation, baseline values, looking for differences. So we've got 12 men and 18 women in the multi-nutrient group. We've got 10 men and 16 women in the fish oil or the omega-3 group. And we've got placebos, 10 men and 18 women. Okay, but statistically, there's no difference across the board. So then the other thing is to look at age. Again, no statistical differences. Maybe there's just a 1 year difference between the groups. BMI, there's maybe slightly overweight, just barely though, so it's probably not a factor. Then they mention blood pressure. This is one of the studies that actually ended up looking at blood pressure measurements later on, which is something that we'll be going over if you're watching the insider's version of this video. And handedness is looking at left and right. So I forgot exactly why, but there's a scientific phenomenon. I'll have to look into it and see if I can post about it after the fact. But somebody taught me about this a number of years ago, that handedness does seem to have an effect. I really don't remember how, but if I can remember, I'll be sure to post something in the comments. And then years in education. This is actually, in other studies, it probably wouldn't matter as much, if at all. But in this situation, it does matter, because you have to think people who have been taxing their brain, who have been pushing their brain, constantly critically thinking in the education system. So as if they get their master's degree or their undergrad or in high school or their PhD education, their postdoc education, that means that they may have a protective effect, because typically if you use your brain, I hate to use the term use it or lose it. It's not quite that simple, but if you use it more without a ton of stress, typically you see greater levels of neurogenesis. You typically see greater levels of synaptogenesis. So all positives to brain health, and that usually staves off the dementia. So this is important, but there's no differences across the board. Okay, so here now we're looking at a number of tests. Again, I'm not going to walk through all the specifics of each test. Plus, I will readily admit I'm not an expert in this. I don't know. I've never performed these tests. I look them up. I have them in my notes, but I don't know the rigorousness of these tests. I'm just trusting that these experts in this field know that these tests are good for measuring cognition. That's all I got. So we've got a number of different measures. So serial 3, serial 7, I think these are, I mentioned I wasn't going to say anything, but I think if I remember correctly from my notes, these are when you count backwards, I think something along those lines, or something related to words. I don't know, something along those lines. And instead of looking at all these values, which can be pretty overwhelming, the first thing to look at, and again, so these two are related, then these two are related. So RT is reaction time, so the speed by which they can answer, and then obviously the accuracy, and then mental fatigue, which is pretty self-explanatory. Instead of looking at all these values, what you can do is look at the treatment. So we've got two different comparisons. Treatment, which is, does omega-3 have an effect? Okay. And then we've got rep 1, rep 2, rep 3, rep 4. What that means is rep is just the number of repetitions that they did the exercise, that they did the test. So obviously, you just think about it. Like if you do something for the first time ever, you're going to be probably pretty bad at it. But if you do it 3 times, you're probably going to be maybe not great, but better than you were at the very beginning, right? So they also test for that. So the one they want to test for, is there a treatment effect? We're just looking at, is there an effect of omega-3s? They also have one for multi-nutrient, but let's focus on omega-3s, which technically they don't distinguish between the two right now. But treatment is there an effect of, let's say, placebo versus omega-3? Then treatment times rep is the treatment, so omega-3s, the comparison of omega-3s plus the number of times that you perform the exercise or the test. And if we look at you're probably not as familiar with the F statistic. So I'm going to focus more on the p-value, which is typically the cutoff is 0.05. So anything below that would be considered statistically significant. There's more nuance than that, but let's just cut it off at that point. The p-value across the board, we can ignore all this other data here. We can just look at the p-value and we can see it doesn't even get close to statistically significantly different. So none of these tests improved with fish oil or with the multi-nutrient compared to placebo. So we can just, typically I would want to look through some of these values just to see, well, maybe they're not getting close. Maybe they're getting close to statistical significance. But honestly, with these statistics values, none of these values are going to be anywhere close to one another. So we're not going to get anywhere any sort of differences. So we can immediately dismiss this and say there's no effect of fish oil on these metrics, according to this study, these researchers. All right, let's move on to study 126. In this one, they do something else that's also unique. You can see by the number of conditions that they have. All right, so, I should mention real quick, this is industry funded, not just associated, but it's actually paid for by industry. Again, if you've been following Physionic for a while, I don't discount studies based off of the fact that they're funded. And I think people that, just as a quick side note, I think that people that discount studies simply because they're funded by industry, I don't think that they understand how industry funding works. It's not as simple as, we just give you money and wink, wink, do your thing. Some of the problems with industry funding could be that they ignore, like if they don't find an effect, they may not publish that. Fine. So that would be a negative, certainly. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the study itself is poor quality or that it's something shady is going on or anything like that. So I don't discount it because there have been plenty of studies that have also been released that are industry funded, that are corroborated by many other publicly funded studies. And I think in general, I think it's just a lazy way of approaching science to just say industry funded, just exclude it. We don't have that kind of luxury sometimes. So, but can it be problematic? Yes, of course. And I've run across those studies as well, which I've pointed out in the past. Okay, now to look at these conditions, we have, you can see there's a lot here. Okay, so we've got our omega-3, let's start here. We've got 144 women and men that were segmented into these 4 different conditions. And these are all parallel design studies, obviously, because it's not a repeated measure or crossover. They were 59 years of age. They were generally healthy. Again, randomized. Great. Again, double-blind. Great. 4 months, certainly shorter duration than the other studies, but still, relatively long. You could certainly debate that that's not long enough, sure. And they separate into the omega-3 plus multivitamin. So the omega-3 plus multivitamin, they consumed a certain amount, a lower amount of omega-3 plus this multivitamin. Then they had another condition that was the exact same, but they doubled the amount of omega-3, the same amount of multivitamin though. And then they had an omega-3 plus placebo multivitamin. So these individuals thought they were consuming a multivitamin, but they were not. And ultimately, they were just consuming omega-3. So that's what we're talking about in this situation. They're just looking at omega-3. So don't get fooled by the placebo by multivitamin. This is the condition we're most interested in right here, the omega-3 plus placebo of multivitamin. And then finally, placebo, which is they consumed a placebo multivitamin plus placebo oil or fish oil, which was sumola oil, which is a high oleic acid omega-9 consumption. So this one did not have exposure to omega-3 or multivitamin. Now let's look at some of the baseline values. Okay, so here we're looking at the baseline values. So we've got our fish oil, so this is the lowest amount with the multivitamin. Then we've got our fish oil at the double, so the highest amount, plus multivitamin. Then we've got just the fish oil. Then we've got the placebo. And we're just comparing across the board. Unfortunately, I didn't actually run any statistics on this as far as I'm aware. No, they didn't. So we're just going to have to play it by eye. And generally, so they have 43 individuals. So the N means the number of individuals in the study. So 160 overall spread out across. The age was roughly the same. Male, roughly the same. So about half. And then the rest obviously were women. Education, again, something else that's really important to look at. And again, it's the same. Then they've got, this is an MMSE. So this is a cognitive test, which is kind of an overall cognitive test to assess the impairedness of one's mental state. And they're, again, roughly the same. BMI, roughly the same. And you can see that going all the way down. I don't need to go into it anymore. So here we're seeing that things are generally the same, even if they're not running the actual statistics to determine the differences between the different conditions. But we can still say, yes, they're the same. Okay, so let's look at some of these results. Again, we've got our 2 multivitamin conditions. We've got our low fish oil here. We've got our high fish oil here. We've got our fish oil alone, and that's across the board. We've got different tests, so reaction time, cognitive speed, short-term memory, and visual memory. And we're looking at this over the 4 months, so the 16 weeks, obviously. And they do another measurement at 6 weeks to determine if there's a difference. Again, this is You don't have to get overwhelmed by these numbers. All you have to do is the first check I would do is look at the p-value. And by the p-value, if you're getting close to significance, then you would want to investigate, okay, maybe let me check the numbers and see, are they getting close to one another? There's a number of checks that you could probably go through. Once I release my course on how to read this stuff, you'll get a much better understanding. But as it stands, the p-value, again, is not anywhere near approaching significance. So again, this study would indicate that there's no effect of omega-3 supplementation on improving any of these indices of cognitive performance. Next, we are going to be looking at study 127, which is public funding and it's industry associated. I believe the reason why is because, I wrote here, some of the authors have ties to industry, at least that they've received funding for previous research that they've done. So this study is publicly funded. Some of the authors have never been associated to industry. Some of the authors have been associated to industry in that they've gotten funding from previous research. And again, just go back one study to find out my impressions of industry funding. Okay, so this one's certainly simpler than some of the others that we've covered. We're going to be looking, they recruited 21 men and women. They had more women. I think it was 70% women, so certainly a slant more towards women, between 66 and 70 years of age. Subjective complaints of poor memory. So again, this is subjective. Again, I think the second study that we covered in this analysis so far, I mentioned one of the problems with subjective measurements, but as it stands, subjective complaints of poor memory. This was randomized, great. Double blind, great. And 6 months long, great. They separated them into a placebo and omega-3. So the omega-3 group is pretty self-explanatory. And the placebo, I don't think they actually mentioned what the placebo was, but presumably something inert. We're assuming here. And they also did something where they controlled for fish consumption to make sure that their diets in that regard, they weren't, so the placebo group wasn't consuming more fish, which would obviously lead to more omega-3 consumption. Okay, so to walk through this, this is looking at the baseline values versus the endpoint, so the 6 months. I realize it's a little blurry. I don't know why they did it this way. It almost feels like it came out of a 1980s paper. The rest of the paper looks, perfectly fine, looks good. And then the quality where they posted the baseline values, like they cut it out of a magazine and just literally glued it into their paper. It's weird. So it looks a little strange, looks a little fuzzy. So the white is the baseline, so pre-supplementation, if that's placebo or omega-3, and the endpoint is after 6 months of supplementation. So the placebo, there's no differences in EPA and DHA, which is the one I'm going to be focused on here. So, which is what you would expect. Okay, great. And then, however, with the fish oil supplementation, you do see an increase in EPA and DHA. Cool. Now looking at other baseline values, looking at, so remember they have 10 for the placebo and 11 for the fish oil. It's not a huge sample size, but if we see any differences, then that may not matter. For age, we see that it's getting close, but I don't think that 4 years difference is probably going to make that much of a difference. If you see it differently, certainly let me know as to why. But the placebo was a little bit younger, 66, and the fish oil were 70 years old. Again, education was roughly the same, so about a year, maybe year and a half difference, not statistically significantly different. Although, again, with this small of a sample size, adding or subtracting one person would probably make a difference in the statistics. Looking at the number of women, we do see that there's 70% in the placebo and 54% in the fish oil. Probably doesn't make a huge difference, but still something to consider. And then a number of other measurements as well. I think this is another one where, no, maybe I don't think so. They didn't end up looking at other health metrics. That's a different study, which again, if you're part of the insiders, you'll get access to that as well. But here are some of the baseline values across the board. I think in terms of like weight, they weren't severely overweight or anything like that. Okay, so now we're looking at what's called an NBAC test. So an NBAC test is these measurements here. And there's, again, greater complexity. You can look up with it what an NBAC test is, but at least now you know what it is. And we're going to be doing comparisons based off of a number of different difficulties. So 0, 1, and 2, 2 being more difficult than 0. And they're looking at baseline values and then after 24 weeks. So all of this is the baseline values, and all of this is the after 24 weeks. So you'll also notice that there are 2 p-values. That's because they ran statistical tests based off of different methodologies. So they used what's known as a t-test for this 1 p-value, so just comparing one versus the other. So comparing, let's say, placebo versus fish oil, they're just doing 2 comparisons. And then with this second one, they're doing a group times visit interaction. So is there an effect? Yes, between the groups, placebo versus fish oil, but is there also a difference based off of doing the test at baseline and then again doing the test 24 weeks later? Remember, the more you do something, typically the better you get at it. So they also wanted to see if there's an interaction with that. And again, if we look at the p-values, look, I mean, there seems to be no difference except maybe here on this 2-back test at week 24, there may be a slight change in the fish oil versus the placebo, because this is approaching significance. And then when they do an interaction effect with repetition, greater repetition, they do see that it is statistically significantly different. So there's a slight increase with the fish oil condition and a slight decrease with the placebo condition, which is something to consider, because if you're talking about effect sizes, so the amount of an effect, 0.86 to 0.9, you're talking about 0.04 difference. That is not much. And then for the placebo to go down from 0.85 to 0.82, that's 0.03. That means that almost 50% of the effect between these two is run by the placebo. That to me does not instill much confidence. If this had remained 0.85 and compared against the fish oil, I don't think you would have seen an effect. So am I blown away by this? I have supremely low confidence that this actually matters. If anything, the effect is so minuscule, it probably you'd never notice it. That's my interpretation of this data. Okay, let's go into study 129. This is nonprofit funding, so no association industry, nothing like that. Just and it's also not government money, but it comes from a nonprofit. So we're looking at 76 women and men, 71 years of age, 57 with mild cognitive impairment, 19 with dementia. This is a kind of a big deal, actually. This is not the way that I would have liked for this to be performed, because now you're talking about heterogeneity in the sample, meaning that so you've got a population of people, the Earth, so people on Earth, and you're looking for specifically mildly cognitive impaired people that don't have dementia, and you're trying to see if omega-3s can reverse some of these problems with mild cognitive impairment, okay? Unfortunately, if you start combining people with dementia, that can either flip the results to where you find no statistical significance, because omega-3s may only help people with mild cognitive impairment and may not help people with dementia, or it could improve the results more than you would normally see with mild cognitive impairment, because now you've added people that have severe levels of cognitive impairment, and they may see great benefits from omega-3, which is great, but it would lead to an improper conclusion, because now we can't conclude, oh, mild cognitive impairment is improved by omega-3 fatty acids. Now you'd have to say, we don't actually know. It could have, unless you do what's known as a subgroup analysis, where you separate out the data from the 19 dementia patients and the mild cognitive impairment individuals and look at the statistics between those two, but then you lose what's known as power. So then now you're unable to tease out the differences because you don't have enough information there to be able to tease out those differences. There's a lot of complexity there. I'm not going to go into it any more than that. But the point is they're combining two what I would consider distinctly different populations. And I don't think that that's the best way to go about this study. But still, I randomly selected this study, so I just decided to cover it. And I'm going to mention this again as we get into the meta-analysis next. So anyway, 57 mild cognitive impaired individuals, which is probably going to drive most of the effect, which is a positive to this study, and a smaller number, 19, with actual diagnosed dementia. This was, again, randomized, double-blind, fantastic, 4 months. Maybe it's a little short, who knows. And then they separated them into omega-3 and then the placebo group. And the placebo was olive oil, just to be clear. Also, another negative of this study is that they only had 75% compliance, meaning that the omega-3 and the placebo group, although they didn't know what they were consuming, they only consumed their treatments 75% of the time. So that's pretty low. I mean, sure, it's more than the majority, but it's still not that great. Usually you'd want to aim for like 80% at lowest, preferably more like 90% or 100%, obviously. So there's some issues with this study for sure, even if it's randomized and double blind and for a decent length of time. Okay, so again, you know the story. Let's look at some of the baseline values. Here we've got baseline. Here we've got our DHA and EPA, which is our omega-3s. So baseline values, they're not statistically different from one another. As far as I know, they did run statistics on this. I would imagine that they did. Actually, I don't know. But I'm assuming that they did, which is an assumption on my part. So baseline values, they were not different. After 1 month, there were increases. I'm assuming they didn't run statistics because I don't see any statistical indices here. Anyway, but you do see an increase. I think you can subjectively see that it's at like 9 compared to before it was at 6. So yes, there's an increase, a real world increase in omega-3 supplementation. That's only after 1 month. And then 4 months, it stays stable. So it's still up there. So even though their compliance was lower, clearly their levels were higher. But that said, it's also possible their compliance was very low at, let's say, weeks 1 to 3. And then they were like, oh, shoot, I've been forgetting to take these pills. So now I'm going to start taking all my pills for the last week. So then it raises the blood levels, but then the blood levels are not an indication of the long-term exposure to omega-3s, which is what we're actually interested in. So this is something to keep in mind, that this could be a little bit, could be misleading. Okay, so then let's look at the actual values that they indicate. So these values, again, we're looking at baseline, month 1 and month 4. These are a number of different measures. Obviously, you understand what mood is. I'm not going to go into all these. I mentioned the MMSE before in some of the baseline values for some of the other studies. And we're looking at, again, these p-values. And we're trying to distinguish if there are any differences between these conditions. And we're going to have another set of values to look at as well. And again, we just don't see an effect. I mean, this is it's pretty remarkable. Yeah, there's no difference between these conditions. So across all the conditions. So if that's the main effect of the treatment, so the omega-3 versus placebo, or treatment by month interaction. So over time, do you see an improvement? And not even there do we see an improvement. I mean, you could maybe say 6.4 to 7.1, and it's maybe starting to get to that point, but it's not statistically significant, and I just wouldn't feel comfortable, especially with, I'm assuming these are standard deviations. I'm not sure. They should indicate the variance. the amount of spread of the data that they collect. With this kind of variance, we'll just, if it is standard deviation, which I think it is, then it would lead even greater levels of lack of trust in that there's actually an effect. So overall, no effect. What about these other measures? Verbal reasoning, visual memory, CLOX-2, which is a measure of executive functioning, which I'll mention a little bit more on that later on. Word finding and battles. Again, these are all things that you can look up. You can just type it into a search engine and it'll pop up. It'll give you some indication of what these things measure. And again, here we're seeing no real effect. The only one that I would consider looking at is maybe this one right here, main effect on visual memory. The PUFA group seems to increase from 9.72 to 11.31, which is actually this statistic. But if we then compare between the two, it does seem like maybe it's trending towards a positive outcome there. So that's a possibility. But again, do I feel strongly about this? No, I don't. So I would conclude with this that there's probably no effect of omega-3s. So what we're about to do is get into the meta-analysis of 17 studies. So grouping together a large amount of data in probably quicker than what I just discussed the other 5 studies in. And we're also going to get into more granularity to look at specifically memory, the effect that omega-3s have on memory, as well as visuospatial functioning, executive functioning, global cognition, and things of that nature. But if you're also wondering about the dosages, if you're thinking which one should I focus on, how long should I be taking it, all these different factors. I'm a woman. Does it still work for me? Does it work in different ways for me? If you're wondering any of those questions, among others, then I've got an extended version of this study analysis in my Physionic Insiders program, which goes into far more specifics on applicable takeaways, what you can actually apply to your life, of course, assuming that you talk to your physician beforehand. So if you're interested in accessing that, as well as my seminars, as well as live sessions with me in a group setting, as well as all my other future study analyses and past study analyses, as well as research reviews, then I would certainly encourage that you check out Physionic Insiders. It helps support my work as well as gives you a huge amount of benefit. And everybody that's already part of the program has been really excited and really taken hold of being part of that community. So I certainly welcome you to join. And if not, then I certainly understand. But I hope that you get a lot of information out of this study analysis as well. All right, with that, back to the video. Okay, now let's look at the meta-analysis. So this is 17 studies, of which the 5 or so that I've covered so far are all included in that meta-analysis. So how I went about this to make things as unbiased as I can possibly make it is that I took this meta-analysis and then I randomly, and what I mean by random, I used a number generator and came up with the numbers of the studies that I was going to be covering. So I picked the number of studies that I was going to be covering. Then I quantified all of 1 through 17, and then I restricted the number generator to 1 through 17 and asked it to pick that number of studies. And it spit out like study number 3. So then I went down the line, picked out number 3, and then I opened that one separately. And that's what we've been doing throughout this period. Now we're adding an additional, I picked 5, I think, or 6. So that would be an additional 12 or 11 studies to this meta-analysis that I have not actually opened up myself. So I'm trusting these researchers to have done their due diligence, mainly because I can't cover 17. I mean, the amount of work that would take to cover 17 studies is astronomical. I mean, people ask me to release content on all these different, they ask me, well, what about this? It's like that simple question of, well, what about this? Like, does it help with heart disease? Or does it help with just a smaller metric, blood pressure? that then means I have to open up another 30 studies or something just to find a conclusive answer to that. And then, I release content on that, and then people are like, well, what about this? It's so much work that I have to limit myself. Otherwise, and I try to do it as unbiasedly as possible. So I'm not saying like, ooh, that study looks interesting. Ooh, that study favors my bias. So it's always randomized, and I always ignore studies that aren't selected by this random number generator. Hopefully that made sense. Anyway, this is public and university funding, so mainly university funding, so it's just internal funding, no association to anything outside. So they've got their inclusion-exclusion criteria. I'm going to go over their exclusion criteria in just a little bit more detail. If you're familiar with meta-analyses, or if you're not, again, something I'll be covering in my course. But they picked out 787 studies, so they just use keywords like omega-3, cognition, omega-3, executive function, it's memory, et cetera, and they ended up selecting 662 after they removed the duplicates that they accidentally had included. Then they screened those 662, looked for full texts so that they could actually access the full texts that were eligible based off their eligibility criteria. They found 69. They excluded of those full text 44 because they used these studies used omega-3s as part of a multi-nutrient study, which we did investigate one of those, but the benefit is that they also had a condition that was just omega-3s. That's why it was included in this analysis, but they probably ignored all the data from the multi-nutrient information. Then not a population of interest, so it's not people with mild cognitive impairment. Primary outcomes of interest were not reported, so they didn't look at particular measures of cognitive measures. So they looked at other measures, and therefore they would be eliminated. So they ended up selecting 25 for the systematic review, and then they only took in 17 for the actual meta-analysis. Systematic review is like where they use some of this information for the discussion, for the introduction. They'll use it to learn certain details and whatnot that are applicable, but maybe they don't have a placebo group or whatever it might be, so they can't be included in the meta-analysis. So they only included 17 studies in the meta-analysis, and that's why I mentioned this meta-analysis is 17 studies, even though they ended up selecting 25. Okay, so here are the inclusion and exclusion criterion. They make a lot of sense. The inclusion criterion is non-demented adult male and female. Exclusion was patients present at least one of the following, so Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Parkinsonism, and multiple sclerosis, et cetera, et cetera. I will push back on this because study 128 that we covered actually did have a small, it was mixed with the mild cognitive impairment, and that's included in this analysis. So if it were me, I would have said don't include that study. But they ended up choosing to include it. So fair enough. It's not going to throw off the results of this entire meta-analysis or anything like that. That one study is not going to have that much power over the 16 other studies, but still something to consider. And then you can read the rest of this. Any omega-3 acid treatment, they restricted a single treatment, even if it's a single group data exists. And then they also have pharmacological treatments, like some of the studies used pharmacological treatments on top of it. So they ended up removing them if they just had those. So if it's like a multivitamin plus omega-3 is the treatment condition, then they just had a placebo condition, because now you can't tease out between the two. You can't tease out between multivitamin and omega-3. They had to have a comparison versus placebo. Obviously, it'd be excluded if it wasn't, et cetera, et cetera. And it was also all randomized clinical trials, including crossover trials. So we didn't actually cover any crossover trials. We just covered parallel, but that's perfectly acceptable as well. So randomized control trials. Okay, so to describe, so these are the measures that they use. So executive function, memory, language, visuospatial functions, global cognitive ability. Let me give you a little bit of a rundown on these. Oh, and I said study 120, I meant 129 was the one with the combination of dementia and mild cognitive impairment. Okay, so executive function generally is tests that are confusing and need to be reoriented to get an accurate answer, like naming the color of a word. So instead of saying the word, you say the color. And so you have to like reorient your brain to program it to say, okay, hey, don't ignore what the word says. It can say yellow being green, and then you have to say green, not yellow. So that kind of stuff. Mathematics, I would fail at that. And reaction time. So those are just a few examples. There's a number of different other measures. So these tests for executive function across these measures are what they included. And we even went over like the NBAC tests, which is what I mentioned earlier. Some of the tests were also Stroop word and Stroop color. That's what I just described. So things like that. Again, I'm not an expert at any of these, so certainly look them up. I looked them up, so I have notes on them, but it seems tedious for me to go through every single test, and this would end up being like an additional hour of me describing tests. So we're just going to trust that these individuals, these experts in the field, know what they're talking about, because certainly they know more than I do. And unless you have a psychology degree, psychiatry degree, or neuropsychology degree, I imagine you probably aren't as familiar as these experts are. So look them up for yourself, learn about them, and if you find something that may be interesting, please share. I'd love to hear it. Okay, so next would be memory. They're looking at episodic memory, working memory, like the COMPASS test, SUCCUB tests, CVLT tests, a memory scale, so short-term memory tests and recall tests, as well as the NBAC tests, which we mentioned earlier. And one drawback of this study is that they don't separate out episodic memory and working memory when they're looking at these studies, which is something that I tried to do, and I was able to distinguish a little bit based off of these tests. So I went through and analyzed a few of the studies and tried to separate out episodic memory tests versus working memory tests, because there are serious distinctions between. Working is just being able to remember particular facts or information in your memory and then recall them. Episodic is being able to remember like different events that happened. So more of like painting a picture, things of that nature. So they are quite different from one another, and unfortunately, they just combine them together into memory. So that does reduce on the sensitivity of this analysis, unfortunately. Okay, so the next one would be language. So line drawings of objects that start with extremely simple objects that are then progressively more complex, and the subject, so the participant, has to name the object. So chair, from something as simple as chair, so it's just a line drawing of a chair. Hey, what is that? Chair. Okay, good, you got it. All the way up to abacus, or some other complex word, like a drawing of something like an anteater or something like that, and they'd have to come up with anteater, whatever the scientific term for it. Maybe I'd fail at these tests. Visuospatial functions is subjects, they actually have to physically move blocks of different colors to match a pattern shown to them. So they get shown a pattern, then they move these blocks to replicate that pattern in the picture form. And then global cognitive ability is kind of a general test overall. So it's like general questions like, what year is it? What state are we in? As well as presenting 3 words to the subject, then asking them other questions unrelated to the 3 words, and then having them recall the 3 words. So it's kind of a combination of several of these different systems. So executive function, memory, and language. Okay, so hopefully you have an idea. I'm going to remind you, as we go through the analysis, I'm going to have a little bit of a definition that I just went over so that you don't have to remember all that in your mind. Okay, let's continue. Okay, so the first one is to look at global cognition. I think that they made a mistake here because they say favors A and favors B, but then they don't actually, as far as I remember, they didn't define between what's A and what's B. I think it doesn't matter. I'll tell you this much because they included 4 studies for this. So this is global cognition, as you can read here, which is what the one I just went over. They use a Hedges G system, which is great, which is what they probably should do to determine effect size and to try to standardize between these different studies. If you're familiar with statistics, you know what I'm talking about. And they used a random effects model, which is typically correct for this type of analysis. Maybe not as much here, but certainly in some of the other studies or other measures as well. And if we look at the overall effects diamond, so these are the 4 studies, right? So the square is the mean result, the average result, and you're going to see that consistently, the mean result. The larger the square means the larger the sample size. So the more individuals that they had in this study. So that's why it's weighted at 61.63, because so the relative weight is high because they had a large number of individuals included, and the variance is low. So the lines poking out both sides, if the shorter the lines are, the closer they are to the box, the better it is. That means that the standard error, the accuracy of this result is probably pretty high. And what they find is that across the board, if you calculate all 4 studies together, you get essentially no effect of omega-3 supplementation on global cognition, which is something that is pretty intriguing, because then you're thinking, oh, wow, okay, maybe there's no effect. But once you start breaking it down further into something like executive function, and again, the same concept, all these are different studies. I don't know how many studies this is, like let's say 10, 11, 12, something like that. And you'll see that, for example, this Culso study is all the way to the right. It's actually off the chart. So treatment benefit would be omega-3 supplementation. Placebo benefit is obviously not omega-3 supplementation. And what they find is that overall, while there's maybe 1 that's not, or 2, 3 or so that don't show much of an effect of omega-3s, most of the studies slightly point towards yes. Some of the studies strongly point to yes, omega-3s have a benefit. And that overall pulls the diamond towards, yes, there is a treatment effect. Is it huge? No, probably not. But we're going to look at some of those, the actual effect size values in just a little bit. The next one is to look at memory. So memory here, again, same story. We see that there's quite a few more that are, a little bit more in the middle, but all of them seem to more pull towards either having no effect or having a benefit towards omega-3. So there's a pull of the main diamond. Then to look at language, again, so the reason why these studies keep fluctuating, some of them have 12, some of them have 5 in these measures, is not because they're just randomly excluding studies, is because some of the studies don't use the tests to measure language. So some of them, so these all used measures for memory, and they didn't use, and then maybe some of them ended up also doing measures for language, but obviously there are far more that did memory than did language. So just to be clear, they're not like biasly just like eliminating studies because they don't like them or anything like that. And we see a slight pull towards the right here in benefit of the treatment or the omega-3s. Okay, so then the other one is to look at language. And, I'm sorry, this is, I've got these mixed up. So this is visuospatial functions. I seem to have messed that up. It's supposed to have visuospatial. So visuospatial is, again, the subject physically moves blocks of different colors to match a pattern that was shown to them. And so you could ignore this. And we see that overall the effect is again in favor of omega-3s, which is all very kind of confusing, right? Because a lot of the studies that we went over did not indicate much of an effect. And we're going to see why that is. So Then they group them all together, and just so we can actually understand some of these effects. So the global cognition score, they had 4 studies included, the number of subjects in each side, so using omega-3s or using placebo. They use a Hedges G, which is what I mentioned is the proper test to measure the effect size. And then we've got our p-value right here. So the global score, if I can go back here, is there was 0 effect on the diamond. And what we find is the Hedges G is 0.01, which is not the same as a p-value. You do not want this to be low. You want this to be high, and relative to like the scale of 1, for example. And that indicates that there's no effect. So if you were to combine these into, while maybe you don't have enough power, you don't have enough participants, but I would argue you probably do. So if you were to combine all these together, you probably don't have the sensitivity to detail that there's an effect. So no, there's no effect. The p-value is way, way far away. So no way that on global cognition that there's any effect. Memory, there's 15 studies included. I think I guessed like 10, 11, 12. There's 15 studies included, and there is a small to moderate effect size, so probably a small effect on memory. So in this measure, yes, there is an effect. The p-value is there. There is great level of what's known as heterogeneity, so the differences between the studies are pretty vast. Let me go back here real quick. Memory. So here, these are pretty consistent, but then you've got some studies that are way off on the right and say that there's a big effect of omega-3s. And then you've got some variability here as well. So these are generally pretty uniform, maybe a little bit between these two or this one and this one. The point is that there's some variability between the studies. And it's pretty high. So this is a heterogeneity test, and it indicates the amount of heterogeneity. So the Q statistic is another heterogeneity test and indicates there is significant heterogeneity. And the I-squared test also indicates that there's high heterogeneity. So we're going to correct for some of that in just a little bit, and I'll get to that in just a second. So executive function, again, there is an effect. It's a small effect, but there is one. Again, statistically significant. There is some heterogeneity, so this would be high level. This would be about moderate level heterogeneity. And again, language, there isn't much of an effect, so it's probably not statistically significant. But even if it were, it probably wouldn't be a huge effect. So language and global score probably don't get much benefit from omega-3s. And visuospatial effects is 8 studies included, and there's a mild effect. So a small effect with visuospatial, and it is statistically significant, and there's moderate heterogeneity among studies. So another thing to consider, though, is what's known as publication bias. So they use what's known as a funnel plot. And this funnel plot or cone plot can indicate the amount of potential bias that exists. So each one of these circles is the study, is one of the studies that's included in this analysis. And usually the ones with the highest sample size, the largest sample size, the largest number of individuals in the study, plus they have low levels of variance, because the more individuals, the more data you collect, the more certain you are about the results. So the standard error starts to decrease. And those larger studies, those more certain studies, tend to be up here. So the standard error is decreased at 0.1 compared to at the bottom at 0.5. So these are the most reliable studies that you would want to rely on. Now, typically the smaller studies have greater standard error, and they would, if there was no publication bias, meaning that some studies were excluded, were not published because they didn't find a result. Or, well, yeah, for whatever reason, if there's publication bias, or I should say opposite. If there's no publication bias, you typically want the smaller studies to follow the same indication as the larger studies. So they would fall right about in the middle. So they would fall right in line, maybe a little bit more on this side. So also indicating that there's an effect. So more on this side, but within this, this cone. However, if you start finding studies that are getting outside of that cone, especially severely outside of that cone, so Hedges G that's way out here, this is a huge effect size, that could indicate one of two primary things. One, that there's publication bias in that somehow this study is biased through any number of different ways. Or two, that this study has identified a subpopulation, a subgroup that all these other studies have not found, which is certainly possible. So let's say this was done in, as I mentioned, I think earlier in this study, in this analysis, in this video, that it's possible that these individuals looked at dementia patients, and omega-3s has a huge benefit in dementia patients, but not so much in just mildly cognitively impaired individuals. So these may all be in mildly cognitively impaired individuals, and this is in dementia patients, and they just see a huge improvement. So that's also possible. Obviously, it's not the case in this scenario because they had supposedly excluded all studies that had done their used groups or samples that were only from dementia patients. So that's not the case. Now, another thing to look at, however, is if you don't see any studies over here, while you do see a few of the larger studies indicate that there's either no effect or maybe a slight benefit towards placebo, or essentially no effect, then you would expect some of the smaller studies to also corroborate that. But we don't see any over here on this side of the line. So that would indicate potentially that all these studies have been eliminated. So there have been studies that have been performed by smaller groups of researchers, smaller studies, smaller sample sizes, and they didn't find an effect, so they just didn't publish, and they just eliminated the study. They just got rid of it and just decided not to publish, which is fine. They're not required to, but it could indicate publication bias or analysis bias, not by the fault of these researchers of this meta-analysis, but just by the way the literature is detailed. So this gives you an indication of if that's the case. It doesn't exactly tease out if it's a subgroup effect or if there's publication bias, but it at least gets you on the track to say, okay, maybe there's an effect here. And most likely there is some publication bias. And that's exactly what they do. So they ended up determining, yes, there's probably some publication bias. So they removed some of these extreme cases of these studies and reanalyzed all of this again. And you can tell that they removed the cognitive, the global cognition, because there was already no effect. So even if you remove a few studies, it's not like suddenly you're going to have this robust effect. But it does change the values that you get for here. So let me remind you here. So for memory, they had 0.31 of a Hedges G. Now they've got a 0.34. So now they see a little bit stronger effect of omega-3s on memory once they've removed some of those studies that may have introduced some of that publication bias. Now, unfortunately, the heterogeneity did not decrease. I don't know if it decreased for any of these. For the language, it seems to have increased because it was 0 before, now it's at 17.34, but it's still quite low. For the visuospatial, they've got 58, and that actually decreased to 0. So this really helped. And you can tell for the visuospatial, they had 8 studies in the initial analysis, and then after the fact, and I promise I'll stop going back and forth. I can realize that would be annoying if you're trying to read this, to 6. So from 8 to 6. And the p-value then, however, went up. So now we don't see an effect with the visuospatial, and we don't see an effect with the language when we're looking at the p-value. But again, in statistics, it's difficult to just look at the p-value. There's a lot of arguments for not just looking at the p-value. So typically you would say that there's probably a mild effect, and definitely on memory. Memory is the big one that it seems to have a positive effect on. Okay, wow. All right, that was so much. We're over an hour and a half in, and if you're part of the insiders, you're going to get a lot more information that's going to get a lot more specific. Okay, so what did we find? That my interpretation of the data, which you could certainly disagree, because certainly the studies that I covered indicate, most of them indicated either no effect or a very mild effect. So something to consider. Omega-3 supplementation has, in mildly cognitive impaired individuals, a mild cognitive improvement effect. That's really key there. That's mild, mainly in relation to memory of all things. And the effects are small, so the effect size that I talked about with the Hedges G, and unlikely to be significantly noticeable. I don't think that if you start consuming omega-3s that suddenly you're going to reverse dementia, or that you're going to protect yourself completely from dementia or anything. But it will at least have some improvement effect. It's just not going to be huge. Now, if you're interested in these topics, so what is the optimal dosing strategy? I took the data from all of these studies and put them together to find a mean, a median, and for each of the omega-3 fatty acids that ended up leading to this memory benefit. I also looked at which omega-3s to actually focus on, some of the other health effects on blood pressure, cholesterol, things like that, and some sex differences on these effects. If you're interested in accessing all that, then I certainly welcome you to hop on over to the Physionic Insiders program, where you get access to this plus much, much more. And with that, I'll hope to speak with you in the near future. Have a good one. Bye.